I would like to introduce myself very briefly. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Currently, I'm head of the Department of Socio-Economics. I founded the Institute of Ecological Economics at the Vienna University of Business Administration. So in the master program, we call it Socio-Ecological Economics, and we bring everything together that it has, what it has in common, that economy and ecology is embedded in society based on the biophysical basis. So we also have to consider societal phenomena and also the biophysical fundamentals. So we do not stand so much for mainstream in economics, and we are very, very open when it comes to other disciplines, political sciences, other sciences, in order to produce knowledge together. In the study that has just been mentioned before for the Climate Action Ministry, and on which I'm going to give my presentation, and well, I will try to share my screen. So it was about taking a look at the use of the EU taxonomy regulation. We wanted to see whether nuclear energy as part of the energy mix can be used as a technology that protects the climate. And as a basis for this, I took scientific literature, I scoured it until September 2020. Coming from various disciplines, so I read up on quite a lot. This is something I really love to do, by the way. So it's a literature study, a literature review, and it considers the extent to which nuclear energy meets those criteria set out in the taxonomy regulation of the European Parliament on establishing a framework to facilitate sustainable investment, amending regulation EU-2019-2088 for a common classification system, the taxonomy regulation. About our approach, we had a focus on the do no significant harm criterion of taxonomy and also on economic viability in terms of a broader concept of sustainability. We also wanted to include that, and I will come back to that later on. The focus is on environmental dimensions. And these are a very, very important basis also for economic action, exclusively academic peer-reviewed journal articles and reports from international and supranational organizations that base their analyses on original data and largely academic peer-reviewed journal articles. 3 criteria have to be fulfilled. The taxonomy regulation contains 3 criteria to be met in assessing whether an economic activity can be classified as contributing to sustainable development. First of all, making a significant contribution to at least one of the 6 environmental objectives, or at least enabling others to make. Secondly, meeting the do no significant harm criterion in all environmental objectives. And thirdly, conformity to the international social standards in production cited in the taxonomy. They are not set out in detail. I concentrated on insights from the WHO and the ILO. So this literature review examines the extent to which nuclear energy meets the criteria of the taxonomy regulation. Criterion 1, making a considerable contribution to at least one of the 6 environmental objectives: climate protection, adaptation to climate change, sustainable use and protection of water and marine resources. transition to a circular economy, pollution, prevention and control, protection and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems. So all these 6 criteria are key, and we have taken a look at all of the 6 criteria. Nuclear energy compared to fossil fuels. So it has lower greenhouse gas emissions and complies basically to the criterion. But controversial discussion whether this technology should be included in a future sustainable energy mix with significant CO2 reductions have to be considered. We have to answer the following questions. Does nuclear energy meet the best-in-class approach in the energy sector? So even if there are fewer, if it generates fewer greenhouse gas emissions than coal, are they part of best-in-class technologies? Are there alternatives? And what are the risks of the technology? This has also been considered in the study, CO2 emissions over the entire life cycle for different energy sources. So I have summarized it on this chart. On the right-hand side, you can see the fossil energy sources. On the left-hand side, you can see nuclear and renewables. And you can see that, of course, nuclear energy reaches a good result in terms of the life cycle. Here, it's also about the concrete that is used for the buildings that house the reactors. And of course, there are different models of reactors. There are different implementation forms. So this is why we use median values and the maximum value as to the kilowatt hour, photovoltaics, hydropower, geothermal energy, hydropower, fossil energy sources, coal, and we compared all these energy types. And what is also surprising is that gas has 50% of the CO2 emissions when compared to coal, but still a significantly high level. And what is interesting, of course, is nuclear when compared to the renewables. And here we can see that there are also others reaching a similarly good result. So there are others that are similarly good or even better. Criterion 2, do no significant harm. For all environmental objectives, we took a look at the risks of nuclear accidents, which has been reduced by way of better technology, but has not been eliminated. Nuclear power requires large amounts of groundwater, and surface water protection against climate change impacts leads to increased costs and reduced productivity due to extreme climatic fluctuations, limiting nuclear power's resilience. Increased water temperature and reduced river flows have already led to reductions and sometimes even interruptions in power generation in recent years. So we need the use of new, more expensive cooling technologies. And here we can take a look at the use of groundwater and surface water bodies according to biomass, oil, nuclear, coal, CSP, geothermal, natural gas, PV, wind. And the further we go down the x-axis, the more water is consumed. So we have the median value, which is indicated here. And here we can see that nuclear is not as bad as oil, hydro, or biomass. But there are other types that are considerably better, of course. Negative consequences of high-dose ionizing radiation on human health. We took a look at that, and evidence is clear. This is a negative consequence with low-level radioactive materials. So There are substantial amounts of waste materials in processed water from uranium mining containing low-level radioactive materials, metals and acids, and initial results of recent studies indicate negative impacts of uranium mining, especially on freshwater ecosystems, but also on marine ecosystems. After 40 to 50 years of development of the sector, the issue of storage of high-level, long-lived nuclear waste with its very long-term consequences is still unresolved. The high-level radioactive waste is still in interim storage. Currently, Finland is preparing a costly option for storage, but also the remediation of uranium mines is unresolved. It's a relevant dimension which does not match the do no significant harm criterion. Criterion 3, social standards in production, uranium mining and processing, conflicts with human rights and safety issues, working conditions of employees in the mines are very problematic, and the human right of access to resources such as clean water and land for the population is put at risk. This doesn't mean that uranium mining and processing does not match to the social standards and couldn't be done that way, but it is not something that we are observing right now. As to the cross-cutting issues, governance, the IPCC concluded that the political, economic, social and technical feasibility of solar energy, wind energy and electricity storage technologies improved dramatically in recent years. No similar improvements for nuclear energy and CCS have been observed. There is lower social acceptance for nuclear energy when compared to other technologies. There are long development times in democratic societies. These are 10 to 19 years per power plant. It can be faster in non-democratic societies. Nuclear's business case has deteriorated in recent decades. So a lot of energy and attention was devoted. Being an economist, I was extremely interested that a few years ago there was a case, an alarming case for renewables, and now there is a business case for renewables at a business level. Well, if you take a look at the technologies, and some renewable energy reach a better result than nuclear energy. Full cost accounting compared to recent success of renewables says that the cost of PV modules and wind turbines were reduced by 80% and 30% respectively in 10 years. So this is responsible for the fact that the business case for nuclear has deteriorated. Here we have another representation of the levelized cost of electricity for maximum and minimum values of capital costs in comparison, where we can see that nuclear is at 82 in terms of the median value, similar to biomass. Coal is a little bit better, gas is a little bit higher, but solar and PV are much lower. Wind onshore is markedly lower, and in this case also gas combined cycle.
Ökonomischer Perspektive in Betrachtung der Stromgestehungskosten ist nuclear nicht best in class.
So nuclear isn't best in class as far as this comparison shows. Other cross-cutting issues, multidimensional risks of nuclear accidents persist. There's safety concerns, there's the risks of uranium, financial regulatory risks, unsolved waste management issues, and concerns in terms of nuclear proliferation. So if all of these things are taken into account as well, then the case for nuclear energy is getting worse and worse. So nuclear energy cannot be considered as a transition or bridging technology because it does not fully meet the best-in-class approach in the sector in terms of climate change mitigation potential. CO2-intensive coal-fired power plants would continue to operate for up to 10 to 20 years until nuclear power plants could be commissioned as their replacement. And due to its high capital intensity, nuclear energy actually hinders the deployment of other low carbon alternatives, and that this capital could be used to develop alternative energy sources such as solar, wind, and hydro. So this has been my presentation that I will now stop. So if you were to look at the taxonomy regulation, if you were to take this as an analytical framework, I would not consider nuclear energy as an environmental friendly or green technology. I would not consider it to be a green technology as far as the small modern reactors are concerned, because the economic case deteriorates even more because there's certain fixed costs that need to be transferred to the fixed costs. And I tried to explain on one slide why nuclear energy is not suitable as a transitional technology either. I'm looking forward to your commentary.
Herzlichen Dank für diese.
Thank you very much for this very concise and concentrated presentation. I do have a couple of questions, so we could start with those. And of course, you're free to use the Q&A. So where does the life cycle of nuclear energy start and where does it end? And to what extent do you believe that this is a cycle? What does this mean for you? Well, the life cycle means that it's not only about electricity generation. So we look at also everything that comes upstream and that is needed downstream in order to ensure that this electricity generation process is made possible in the first place. So ideally, I would provide you with one definition that applies to all analysis. That was the basis of my conclusions, but I can't do that because these various studies are using different unit of analysis. So I had to base myself on what the respective study in question was dealing with, because this was a meta study. So I only compiled scientific studies and did not do my own studies. But if you take it the life cycle assessment, you need to start in the beginning, in the preparation of the power generation process, and you also need to consider waste management as far as possible. But I cannot exclude that there are some minor differences at the intersections. And life cycle analysis, well, that comes from environmental management. There's nothing circular about this life cycle, not in the sense of the circular economy by any means. Okay, thank you. This answers that question from the Waldviertler Energiestammtisch, a table of regulars in the pub of ecological people, ecologically minded people. So the renewables have, of course, much lower costs for greenhouse gas emissions. Is there nothing new, or provocatively speaking, is it better for non-renewables to use 15-year-old figures from 2007 as a basis? Well, I used all the figures I could find, and it was not only 15-year-old data by any means. I also had more recent data. I'd have to go back to the slides to see where I refer to 2007 figures. Maybe some comparative studies, maybe 2007 was when the last comparison was done, but of course also included more recent studies. And of course, as far as renewables are concerned, and I've tried to show this explicitly, we have seen a very positive dynamism, and renewables do much better than 10 or 15 years ago, of course. And very briefly, often there have been reports from consultants that were more recent or showed a better representation, but where the data source wasn't so clear. So it was very conservative, very cautious when it came to choosing sources. So only peer-reviewed academic journal articles were used, or analysis coming from international organizations that have their own data. A question that can be quickly answered, coming from Ursula. Can I get your study? Well, it's available on the web. Yeah, I will put it in the chat. Yeah, so you can download it. Okay, excellent. Then there was a question asked by Philip Kronbichler. How do you use the fourth generation of dual fluid reactor power plants? Well, I'm not an engineer, but the more modern reactors are, of course, designed to address earlier problems. Among other things, that planning large reactors is a very time-consuming process. And those newer, more modern reactors are designed to be more reproducible in a standardized modular format. And these modular units are normally much smaller than the current units, also in order to reduce the risks. That's understandable as far as the approach is concerned, and I guess it's positive, but the problem from the economic perspective is that the price per kilowatt hour goes up. And this already problematic business case becomes even more problematic as a consequence. Okay, looking at the time, I think we have plenty of time and plenty of questions, so let me move on with the questions. Manfred Doppler has a question. When it comes to the assessment, did you also consider the global share of nuclear energy? I don't know how I should have included this in my assessment. I looked at different power generation technologies and compared them with each other, but whether gas has a very high share or coal has a very high share and nuclear energy a much smaller share in the global energy generation, well, I didn't consider that. No, that wasn't the task at hand. So I only wanted to talk about, you only wanted to talk about the price and the consequences and the potential. I do understand the question, and in other publications, we did look at that because, for example, if you take a look at an energy system for, well, for example, southeastern England, where I did my analysis, we always calculated scenarios where we had very concrete energy technologies that were to be used, because of course there's a difference if you use 10% of your energy from wind or 60% of wind, because intermittency is a big problem. And it's not a problem for nuclear energy. So I understand the scale question, but here it was only about the impact of technology as shown by literature. So we try to put the results into context, and of course they come from different contexts. I understand the purpose of the question, but this doesn't have an impact or bearing on my study. There's another question. What is the lifetime for coal-fired power plants or nuclear power plants? I guess you will have used a certain parameter for the lifetime of such a power plant. Well, I didn't make any assumptions myself. I always used the assumptions or accepted the assumptions that were the basis of the various studies under question. So if nuclear power plants were calculated for a certain planning period, and if the lifetime of the power plant was extended, then of course this is not taken into account in the study. Another question on the selection of literature. So there's a criticism voiced by Julia Bonert, or maybe just a justified objection. The IAEA is a lobbying organization, so we have to be honest about this. And Christoph Wieland said the results about the economic efficiency and the business case of a nuclear power plant as calculated by the German Institute of Economic Research. So this was not taken into account, but it exemplifies that without state support, the price of electricity was never economically viable. So could you talk about this? It's a similar case as Gordon McCarran from the University of Sussex. I think for 3 decades, he's been saying that in his publications. So I did use literature that was based on academic journal articles, reports of the DIW and Ms. Kempfert and her team. I respect them, I appreciate them, but of course I had to make a cutoff at some point. I couldn't say, well, I like this researcher because I know her, and others whom I haven't had the chance to have an exchange with, I will exclude those. Well, I can't do that, of course. So this is why I used this relatively conservative criterion of peer-reviewed international journal articles. 95% of the quoted literature is that. The remainder comes from International Energy Agency. And yeah, but of course they have a different status than just a consulting report. So this is why I used some selected articles, but only to a limited extent. And as to the substantial point we're talking about, namely the fact that nuclear energy has not really turned out to be economically viable. Well, I agree with this assessment 100%. I have just seen another question that I think is very interesting. And the energy pub in the Waldviertel region. So the assessment of the final storage of nuclear waste. Well, this is not really reflected because this final storage doesn't exist yet. This is only hypothetical, right? Yes, and this is why it wasn't part. I just highlighted it as a problem. I was at the University of Sussex when Gordon McCarran headed this body of the British government that was working with a staff of engineers coming from British universities to identify the best possible final storage. And the answer was there's no best possible solution. There's all kinds of third-rate storage options for the final storage of nuclear waste. But of course, I can only highlight it as a problem. Andreas Fellner asks, how do you rate the analysis of the OECD dated 2020 on system costs with a high share of nuclear renewables? Are you aware of this study? Well, I have to pass to, I don't know about this study either. So as far as the questions are concerned, I think we've answered most of them. Carsten Rau as to the SMR, the small modular reactors, that they're to be built like on a conveyor belt, the production line. Well, all of that has been addressed in the study, right? Well, as far as there are any publications in international peer-reviewed journals, yes, I have considered it. The main problem is the rising costs per kilowatt hour for smaller reactors. Well, there's a lot of questions. Maybe you have the time and the leisure to peruse them. Generation 4, we had this 4th generation reactors, yeah. Another provocative question by Andreas Fellner. Since PV had similar values in the study, would PV also be eliminated from the mix, or because it wouldn't be best in class either? Photovoltaics. So there was some slide, and I did notice this myself, that the values for PV were, of course, higher than those of nuclear, but this is a provocative question, of course. So would PV also be not considered? But I guess this is due to a high level of complexity. Or the power generation costs for more recent PV systems are lower than for a kilowatt hour of nuclear energy. So the longer the observation period, the worse PV does. But if you look at the more recent systems, then PV does better. Apart from that, there are a lot of problems. It's not that there are no problems, but a lot of the problems that occur in nuclear energy, as far as the environment is concerned, do not occur to such an extent for PV. So photovoltaics, I would say, the more sophisticated modern PV and also onshore wind are best in class in terms of that. Okay, let me say that as far as the anti-nuclear scene is concerned, well, this is not part of the taxonomy because of the significance principle. So this would be enough for not investing in nuclear energy if we focus on the criteria of sustainability. Okay, so what are we going to do about this, dear professor? That we get the EU not to twist this out of shape and let in the nuclear lobby so that this lying industry, as we refer to them, is trying to lie to make nuclear power look more sustainable. Well, I'm just a humble economist. Well, France is different than Austria, of course. They are going to try to flex their political muscles, but this is beyond scientific studies. I base myself on scientific studies, and here the conclusion is quite clear-cut. Okay, thank you very much.